Hey, Drew again, and Pam and Tommy on Hulu. The first three episodes are out, and these are the three that are directed by Craig Gillespie, the director of I, Tonya with Margot Robbie. And this has a similar style to that in some ways. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of Wolf of Wall Street, just in terms of the excess, both in terms of the lifestyles and the sexuality on display. And it also reminds me of Boogie Nights in that it kind of explores the underside of the adult film industry and kind of has some very seedy, grimy characters. It also at times reminds me of I, Tonya, the previous film that Craig Gillespie directed. But all these things, it feels like a movie. It really, really does feel like something that's on par with something that you could see in theaters even. No expense seems to have been spared. And the actors, even Seth Rogen, who I can't say I'm really a fan of, are quite well cast and do really, really good jobs of portraying their characters. I'll give more detailed breakdowns of what I thought of the performances in a moment. But for all that, like I do think this is like a movie killer type miniseries. Like it's going to make it really hard for movies to justify going to theaters when you can make miniseries this good. But there's a couple flaws with this that I think might hold it back, but I imagine this is going to be in awards conversations. I imagine this is going to be all over the place and quite a sensation. But my biggest issue is similarly to how with American Crime Story impeachment, a lot of people felt that it was important that Monica produce so that it not be exploitative of her, so that it could be her story. The fact that Pamela Anderson had no involvement with this, I think it's a kind of a red flag. And, like lots of times people have their story told without, getting their permission, the people doing it getting their permission. But in this case, I think it's kind of bad on the part of the producers because they've taken this story that's about these two people that were very, very much in love. And the way that this miniseries portrays it, and I don't think this is true to life, but this is the way the miniseries portrays it, their relationship was unable to survive being exposed to the tabloid journalism of the 1990s. And if you take that point of view, and that's the point of view the miniseries takes, then why on earth would you make a miniseries that is portraying, albeit a fictionalized one, their private lives, the very things that they didn't want exposed before, the things that you're saying broke up their relationship? I feel like there's a little bit of lacking self-awareness there. But I really did enjoy the first three episodes, a lot more than I expected to, honestly. I wasn't sure how much of a story there could be here, but they've found ways to make it compelling. They've gone deeper with the character work than a lot of these types of miniseries go. And like I said, it's just very well shot and edited and just perfectly done across the board. It has a really, really peppy soundtrack. I think the soundtrack is going to be a standout feature for a lot of people. Like a lot of people aren't going to talk about the deeper themes. They're not going to think that hard about what it's saying and what the messages are, but they're going to be like, oh yeah, it just felt good watching Pam and Tommy going around those mansions and parties and montages and having the peppy 90s songs that we all enjoyed back in the day playing over it. So again, very entertaining. It's very easy to sit back and not think too hard about this. And a lot of people will probably say, that's my approach. I just don't want to think. I just want to enjoy it and see an interesting story. And this is an interesting story if that's what you want to do. It really does explain everything. If you're not really familiar with Tommy Lee and Pamela Anderson and their whirlwind romance, they got married after 4 days. And then, how things ended. Well, this really does explain it all so you can really understand it even if you're not that familiar with it. It really takes a Ryan Murphy approach. There are some scenes that are a little clunky in terms of exposition. There was one scene in particular where, it made sense because they only, knew each other for 4 days before they got married. They're still finding out lots of things about each other. But there was one scene in particular where Lily James, Pamela Anderson, is just asking questions to Tommy Lee about his background. And a lot of it just seems like, yeah, maybe she would ask these questions, but this is kind of an information dump, and it's not being done in a particularly clever way. But for the most part, I felt like this series managed to give us all the information we needed about the characters without being too expositional, as oftentimes Ryan Murphy series can feel. A lot of times you can feel like you're getting the Wikipedia summaries of these characters' lives. And some people like that, but for me, I'm like, I can go to Wikipedia, so do it in an interesting way if you have to give us this information. And they do a good job at that on the whole. I liked that these episodes all had a very interesting perspective. I mentioned Seth Rogen. I'm not a major fan of his, but he does a good job of being this character who's beaten down and abused by Tommy Lee, who as his contractor, and you see Tommy Lee in quite a different light in the first episode than in the next two. And just the justification that this person would have for doing what he did and stealing this tape. It's not very reflective of the first 3 episodes as a whole. I think it's kind of its own thing, but it is interesting just how much detail they give us about Seth Rogen's character. He has a lot of interesting quirks and personality traits, and just how he went about doing what he did. And apparently, almost all the details here are not made up. They're actually correct details, which is pretty astounding. So this first episode kind of felt like a Steven Soderbergh film, kind of a Logan Lucky heist type story, which segues into a second episode where we get this high-level view of the relationship between Tommy Lee and Pamela Anderson and how that kicked off. And I think this is a really important episode because it establishes the before. It shows you what, was attractive about Tommy Lee, his passion for living in the moment, his spontaneity. He was a very, very hard to like individual in a lot of ways, and I think this series portrays that. But it also shows what, Pamela Anderson might have thought was appealing about him. He was a bad boy, as the series very well points out. But I think that I've heard disturbing reports that this series kind of glosses over how their relationship ended and some of the behavior on Tommy Lee's part. And if that's the case, I'm disappointed to hear that, because I feel like it's necessary for the audience to understand those dark layers to his character, to understand this relationship truly. And I suspect that the reason that didn't make the cut was because it didn't fit the narrative that this relationship would have worked out if it wasn't for the interventions of tabloids and all of the media frenzy that happened because of the release of this sex tape. Nonetheless, I think that this episode does a good job of putting you in their shoes and helping you see what it would have been like to be in this relationship. As I said, this series very much goes there with the sexual content. It doesn't take an American crime story impeachment approach where it minimizes the salacious content. It very much maximalizes the salacious content, but mainly just in this episode from what I can tell so far. But this is not something that you really want to watch with your mother unless your mother is really, really hip. There's one scene in particular I think that we'll get a lot of talking about, in which Sebastian Stan's character literally has a conversation, let's say, with a portion of his anatomy, and that portion of his anatomy gets a lot of screen time in the second episode. But there's also a lot of aspects of this where they're kind of objectifying Lily James Pamela Anderson, focusing on her physique, that you could kind of justifiably criticize, I feel, for doing the same thing that the show accuses the male producers of the time of doing. The second episode kind of shows to some extent how, at some point Pamela Anderson might have enjoyed being thought of as desirable, but at another level she hated being pigeonholed as this person whose main appeal was their sex appeal and had nothing else to offer. So that, to me, is an interesting thing to see explored. I feel that Pamela Anderson gets a lot less development in this series than Seth Rogen and Sebastian Stan's characters. I feel like Tommy Lee and Seth Rogen's character get a lot more character development in the first 3 episodes, and maybe they'll rectify that later. But to me, as good as Lily James' performance is, and I think a lot of people will call her the standout, it's interesting to me that despite being the most famous or infamous person in this situation, that to a large extent, I feel like she seems peripheral to the main story. And while Lily James really does transform into Pamela Anderson in a lot of ways, particularly with the makeup and other things that they've done to make her look like Pamela Anderson, I still feel that this performance feels kind of surface level. I don't feel like she portrays a lot of the complexity of Pamela Anderson and what she might have been feeling as a person. I feel that you watch interviews with Pamela Anderson, you watch the real life Jay Leno interview that is replicated at the beginning of the first episode, and you see a lot more pushing back against this pigeonholing of her, and you see that she was more aware, I think, more self-aware than this series is giving her credit for. So to me, I feel like there could have been more nuance there, and I'm a little bit wishful that they had made more of an effort to do that. I think part of it might be with the development of Tommy Lee and Seth Rogen's characters, as they are more active characters within this story. And to a certain extent, Pamela Anderson was more of a passive character in this story. She didn't really have a whole lot she could do under the circumstances. And you see that in this episode in the way that, the male producers and directors that were running TV in Hollywood at this time really had control of her image and her career in a way that she did not. Third episode, this is where the story really starts to take off. We see Seth Rogen's character, Nick Offerman, setting out to sell the tape and not having any luck. And then this is where it becomes interesting, similar to American Crime Story Impeachment, where you see how the early days of the internet allowed things to happen that had never happened before. How, as this person that they're going to for money, who's kind of got a criminal background, says no one has ever made money off of this type of tape, because the minute you put it out there, the police show up. And then there's this really interesting scene where Seth Rogen explains how the internet makes it possible to put this out there and be untraceable. And you see how people didn't really understand the internet at this time, and how a lot of people were really just taking advantage of the lack of legal understanding that was out there, the lack of ability of law enforcement to prosecute people who do the types of things that they do in this miniseries. So that was fascinating stuff. And I think that they do a good job of making Seth Rogen and Sebastian Stan's characters, who are both kind of unlikable in a lot of ways, giving them some depth, giving them some likability. I think Sebastian Stan's performance is probably the standout performance of the series so far, because he really is just playing this character with so much gusto, with so much intensity, and but still bringing in these layers of nuance to the portrayal that I just don't think are quite there with Lily James' character yet. So I really enjoyed the first 3 episodes. I'm interested to hear what you all think. Let me know in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of this show and other shows, please consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, thank you for watching.